We have Professor Alan Winfield, plus his dog Lola.
Lola?
Yeah, you heard me say your name, didn't you? Let's come to say hello.
It is, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
You see? Very sweet. But one of the things that Alan says about his talk, he's going to, at the end, explore the Asimov Three Laws of Robotics idea, because it's gone a bit dead, and he was telling me earlier, it's starting to be revived a bit, because honestly this is a very important issue for all of us, robotic ethics, and where it might lead, and where perhaps we need to think about it before it hits us on the head. And I will pass you over to Alan, and if you would welcome him in the news like that.
Thank you, Sheila, for that introduction. It's great to be here, and Happy New Year. The ethical roboticist. So the talk is going to broadly be in two parts. The first part, robot ethics, that is how roboticists must be ethical, and part two, ethical robots, so how robots could be ethical. So robot ethics, I'm going to start actually with a little story which you might find fun. So this is back in 2009, I think, when I was a relatively, as it were, inexperienced robo-ethicist. And I had a call from the Sunday Times, and it was the science correspondent, and he said to me on the phone, it's Friday afternoon, he said, did I know that there was a meeting of the American Association for Artificial Intelligence to discuss robot ethics? And I said, no, I didn't know that they were meeting. And then he said, was I surprised that they were meeting to discuss robot ethics? And I said, no, of course not. That's what we do. You know, it's a case of scientists behaving responsibly. And really there wasn't a story. I mean, scientists behaving responsibly is not really a story, is it? And I didn't expect anything to appear in the Sunday paper, but it did, and this was the headline. So that's what you get, you know, for behaving responsibly. And it's dreadful. You probably can't read all of this, but it says that scientists are privately so worried that they held a secret meeting behind closed doors, none of which is true. Okay, and the funny thing is that by lunchtime on the Sunday, I had radio, the Today programme were on the phone, and I ended up on the Today programme the following morning, Monday morning, saying, no, scientists do not fear a revolt of killer robots. So there we go. That's the life of a robot ethicist. So people often say to me, so what does a professor of robot ethics do? The short answer is that I worry. I'm a kind of professional worrier, really. And what I want to do this evening is share with you a little bit of what I worry about. I worry about a lot of things. I think there are many things to be concerned about, and I can't go through all of them. So I'll just give you a few snapshots, if you like, samples of some of the things I worry about. In fact, given that your next talk is about driverless cars, I'm going to start with, this wasn't deliberate, this was coincidental, with worrying about driverless cars. So in May 2016, Joshua Brown was not driving. In fact, he was sitting in the passenger seat, not paying attention, of his Tesla. The Tesla was being driven by the autopilot, and the autopilot essentially failed to spot a large trailer crossing the highway in front of the car. And essentially, Joshua Brown was not paying attention. He should have been paying attention, but he was not. And the car just drove straight under the trailer, and he was killed outright. Okay. And this picture here is from the National Transport Safety Board report, actually showing the trailer, you can see, turning left off the highway, and the car colliding with it, and then it was going so fast that you can see it ended up right over here in this field, and Brown was killed instantly. Now, that crash has been investigated by the National Transport Safety Board, but here's the thing. They know that the autopilot failed to see the trailer, the white trailer. It thought it was sky or something, but they do not know why. They don't know why. They were unable to discover exactly what caused that accident. That's important from an ethical point of view. So it's really the question, the ethical problem is that it's the ethical problem of beta testing autonomous systems, and in this particular case, autopilot, an AI-driven autopilot, in real-world conditions. The point is that Joshua Brown, in effect, as the owner of the car, was a test subject in, untested software. The point is this software had not been formally verified. Of course, that, in fact, was not the first of the Tesla fatalities. There was a more recent one in Mountain View in California in last year, March 2018. An even more egregious accident, in my view, was the accident that happened in March 2018, where an Uber driverless taxi, this is it, drove into a cyclist. In fact, she was not actually pedaling her bicycle, Elaine Hertzberg. She was wheeling her bicycle across the road. It was at night, and the car didn't see the bicycle or her. In fact, just drove straight into her. And the investigations so far appear to suggest that the governor of Tempe, Arizona, had secretly done a deal with Uber to allow them to do testing in the city of Tempe. So the point is this. It's highly unlikely that she knew that these tests were going on. That's deeply unethical in my view. Deeply, deeply unethical. So it's the ethical problem, if you like, of unwitting human test subjects.
What was established to be the failure in that?
We don't know yet. The investigation is still going on. We know that the Uber driver, who was charged with paying attention, was not paying attention. And this is a fundamental problem with driverless car autopilots, where you are required to pay attention and take over at a moment's notice if the autopilot fails. That's the current paradigm, if you like, of driverless cars. So these are questions you should put to your next speaker. That is the prevailing paradigm. And as far as I'm concerned, it's completely mad to essentially provide an autopilot that gives you nothing to do. So you have nothing to do, but you're still supposed to pay attention so that you can take over at a moment's notice. So these are deep ethical problems as far as I'm concerned. So, here's a different... and in fact I co-wrote a piece in the Guardian last year with Jack Stilgo about this whole kind of thing about driverless cars investigating their own accidents, which is typically what happens. So here's an obvious ethical problem, which is the problem of robots that displace jobs. Of course, robots have been displacing jobs for many, many years. So these first-generation robots have been around 40, nearly 50 years in assembly plants, in warehouses and so on. But a new generation of robots are either replacing or are said to be replacing jobs. For instance, in care, healthcare, or in driverless taxis is another driverless car. I have to say that I really believe that we're addressing the wrong question here. When we say, can we be, how can we make sure that robots do not replace jobs? Actually, the question should be a different one entirely, which is how do we make sure that the wealth created by automation is shared by all? Because, the point I make is this. The whole point of automation is that we should all work less. If automation doesn't result in us working less, we're failing. It's pointless. It is utterly pointless. It's worth remembering that John Maynard Keynes, economist, in 1930, and Harold Wilson, Prime Minister, 1965, Labour Prime Minister, very famous speech, the White Heat of Technology speech. Both of those gentlemen predicted 3 or 4 day working weeks by the year 2000. And those were not gloomy predictions. They were optimistic. They were aspirational predictions because they felt that they thought that the benefit of automation would be that we would be released from the shackles of work, all of us. Of course, that hasn't happened at all. In fact, what's happened is, the economics is very interesting. So forgive me for being a little bit economics here, a little bit economics. So this graph is very interesting. It's in a book called The Second Machine Age, and it shows that productivity and wages, this is in the US, but it's still an interesting graph, productivity and wages increased in step until the mid-1970s. Since then, productivity has continued to increase, wages have flatlined. Now that reveals a lot. I mean, this graph tells you a lot. It basically tells you that all of this wealth, because this gap represents wealth. In fact, it represents trillions of dollars of wealth that have gone to shareholders and executive and financiers, not to workers. So until the mid-1970s, essentially workers shared in the wealth that they were creating. Now they don't. So this is essentially a massive transfer of wealth from from income to capital. So, forgive me for getting a bit political, but it seems to me that the real problem is the ethical problem of ensuring everyone shares the wealth created by robotics and AI. And we're not doing that right now. And just for something completely different...
Robot actually. Oh, are you surprised that I'm a robot? Take a look at me. I look just like a human, don't I? Well, it was really hard to recreate a robot which looks just like a real human. More than you would imagine. Because you can tell that I'm not a real human.
So my guess is that if you saw this robot on the other side of a crowded room, you'd probably think it was a person. Of course, if you actually interacted with the robot up close, you realise it's not a person, it's a machine. But the point is, it's a remarkably lifelike robot. In fact, this picture here, this is actually a robot. This is not Henrik Schäfer. It's a robot doppelganger, if you like, that he commissioned of himself. So it's a robot head. And this gives rise to what I call the ethical problem of robots that appear to be intelligent but are not. Essentially, this is the situation. We can build very lifelike android robots. You see them here. But we cannot build the AI to match the expectation of their appearance. In other words, we cannot build human equivalent artificial intelligence. And we are don't believe any of the predictions. Some people say we'll have human equivalent AI in 10 or 20 years. That's nonsense. It won't be in any of our lifetimes, even our friend over sitting there, probably not in your lifetime. So a very long time before we have robots as smart as people, as smart as you, in fact. And it's what I call the brain-body mismatch problem. And it's actually also a problem. I think the problem is almost more fundamental. We shouldn't be building, as far as I'm concerned, android robots that look like people, nor should we be gendering robots. And there are too many gendered robots. More often they're female, they're fembots, if you like. And so it's the gendering, in fact it's even worse than that, it's the sexualization of robots. And I think these are serious ethical problems. So that's where I'm going to stop with the ethical problems, because I could carry on. There are many other aspects of robotics and AI that are troubling. You'll notice what I've not said is, well, I've kind of said it, I'm not afraid of super intelligence. So we do not need to be worrying about artificial super intelligence. That's nonsense. That's just, fun stuff that you read about in the papers or in the movies and so on. But, okay. So, of course, it's not enough just to be a worrier. It's no good just worrying about stuff. You need to do something about those worries. So what I'm going to do in the next few slides is to show you some of the things that are going on in order to address the ethical issues around robotics and AI. So let's first just pause and ask ourselves, how is it that we trust our technology? Why is it that you and I quite happily get on an aeroplane and we are pretty confident that we'll be safe? Well, it's because of standards, safety certification and regulation. The only reason that passenger aircraft are so unbelievably safe is because it's an extraordinarily well-regulated industry. And when accidents happen, very rarely these days, they are extraordinarily deeply investigated. So, the quality, the robustness of accident investigation is one of the reasons that we trust aeroplanes. It's not the only reason, clearly. There are many, many other reasons, but that's one of them. And really, without very strong governance frameworks, we just wouldn't trust our technology. It's one of the things that gives rise to trust. And this is a kind of, if you like, a little map of the connection, if you like, between ethics and regulation. So this is a diagram that I developed when I gave written evidence to the 2016 UK parliamentary inquiry on robotics and AI. And essentially what I'm saying here in this picture is that ethical principles lead to standards, and I'm going to speak in a minute or two about standards, and in turn, standards underpin regulation. Many standards are voluntary, but some standards are not. Some standards are mandated by law, especially if they're safety-critical systems. So let's go back for a second to driverless cars. There are no standards yet for driverless car autopilots. None. Yet there are cars driving around in this country and many other countries right now with those autopilots. Yet there are no standards. So essentially there's no regulation. The only regulation is that you have to be sat there, in front of the wheel like this, but paying attention all of the time, every minute, so that you can take over. That's the only regulation. You are in charge of the car, not the autopilot, even though the autopilot's driving the car. I seem to have a downer on driverless cars tonight, so I won't go into detail over the rest of this, but essentially, I think once you have regulatory bodies, you also need public engagement, because without, here's an example. When there are air accidents, as I say, very rarely, we know about what's going on in the investigation immediately. So the air accident investigators give press releases almost by the hour. And very quickly, the public, we know what happened and why. And that's all part of building trust. if it was all secretive, and it's true, isn't it? The air accidents that worry us the most are the ones where actually they haven't been able to figure out what happened. They're the really worrying ones. So public engagement together with regulation gives rise, I think, to trust. Of course, I'm simplifying, but I think this is essentially part of the picture. Now, I'm now going to talk a bit about standards, and I've been involved or am involved in two standards organisations. The first one that I was involved in since about 2012, I think, is the British Standards Institute. And in April 2016 we published this. And this is the world's first ethical standard in robotics. It's called BS 8611. And it's a guide to the ethical design of robots and robotic systems. So what is it? You may wonder, what is, and what does an ethical standard look like? Well, this one, in fact, actually is a method for doing an ethical risk assessment. Now, this all sounds a bit boring, but those of you that have ever had any contact with ethics, research ethics committees, will know that that's what they do. They conduct a risk assessment. What are the ethical risks associated with this particular project that you're about to do? Well, this is the same idea, except that you're doing an ethical risk assessment for your new robot. Before you're actually selling, this is before you sell it, before you market it, it's while you're designing it. And what you do is that you look at various ethical hazards and risks and try and reduce the likelihood of those risks. So what kind of risks, you may ask? Well, is there a risk that you might over-rely, become over-reliant, become dependent on your robot? Is there a risk, in fact, you might become addicted to your robot? Is there a risk that your robot might deceive you? So these are all, they're psychological risks, if you like. There are other more down-to-earth risks, like is your robot recyclable? Is the robot manufactured sustainably? Is it repairable? So it's a very wide range of ethical risks. So I think it's a really great standard. I'm a strong advocate for this, and for the, if you like, the process of ethical risk assessment, which is really part of a kind of larger process. And I know several people in the audience who work in responsible research and innovation. And ethical risk assessment is, if you like, a part of responsible innovation. So the other standards body that I'm involved in is the IEEE. This is the US-based Institution of Electronic Engineers. And in 2016, early 2016, they launched this global initiative on the ethics of intelligent and autonomous systems. It's an amazing initiative, really, really ambitious, and it's trying to, if you like, change the conversation around intelligent systems away from growth and wealth creation to the benefit of humanity, to human well-being. So it's trying to shift the conversation so that we see intelligent systems as, if you like, artifacts that should benefit humans, should benefit humanity. If they don't, then we shouldn't be doing them. So that should be the bottom line: benefit to humanity, not benefit to shareholders or just engines of economic growth. Economic growth is fine, providing it benefits humanity and all of humanity. I don't just mean a few elites. Sorry, I keep getting a bit political. I don't know why that is. But, and so what are we doing in the IEEE? So the first thing we published is this document. It's now in version 2, called Ethically Aligned Design. And if you like, it's a kind of discussion document full of lots of ethical worries. So it's, if you like, it's going back to my ethical worries. but there are hundreds of them in here, not just 3 or 4. Compiled by, I think, 13 different committees who worried about everything from the law to autonomous weapons to superintelligence. Yes, we really do have a committee worrying about superintelligence. Affective computing, that's systems that are designed to be artificially emotional. So a big range of concerns. And of course, being a standards body, we've also started writing standards. And they're called the P7000 series, which we call human standards. So they're not technical standards, they're human standards. So that's very important. And this is the first serious set of standards being written. They're still in development. None of them have been published yet. It takes typically 5 years from start to finish to write a standard. And this is the first serious body of standards focused entirely on artificial intelligence. So I think that's really significant. So P7001, which in fact I'm leading, is on transparency. So, and I'll say a few words about that just in a minute. P7002 is on data privacy. That's a really important thing. The general principles that we have, overarching principles, are around human rights. Number 1, well-being. How can we ensure that artificial intelligence and autonomous systems increase human well-being? Accountability. How can we be sure that these systems are accountable? In other words, the people who design them or own them are accountable. Remember, the systems themselves can never be accountable. So robots are not persons and should never be, as far as we're concerned. How can we make sure they're transparent? I'll come on to that. And how can we make sure that we minimise the risks of their misuse? That's, again, very important. So I already mentioned that we have several standards in development. In fact, this is just the first 4. There are now 14 of these standards in development. And quite a few of them are in essentially algorithmic bias, privacy, data protection types of concerns, if you like. Now, I promised that I'd say just a few words about P7001 because this is my particular baby, if you like. And P7001 is based on the very simple ethical principle that it should always be possible to discover why an intelligent system made a particular decision. Always. And, of course, that's very easy to say, but for many systems it's hard to do. And now, the important thing to say here is that transparency is not one thing. So the transparency, for instance, required by a user, imagine an elderly person who has a care robot, and she needs to understand what the robot is doing and why it's doing it. But that's a different kind of transparency that the engineer who certifies the safety of the robot needs. So that engineer needs a very deep technical level of transparency. So does an accident investigator. Clearly, accident investigators need a different kind of transparency again. They need, for instance, data logs, the kind of transparency that you get from a black box, which is the thing that aircraft have. Lawyers and expert witnesses need another kind of transparency. So really, what I'm saying here is that, in fact, in P7001, we're actually writing 5 standards in one, where each of those 5 standards is for a different stakeholder group. These groups are, if you like, the beneficiaries of the standard. These are the groups who will benefit from this standard being used when the system is designed. So it's something that I feel very passionate about, this question of transparency. And it's amazing how many people, AI people say to me, no, you can't do that. You can't insist on transparency. That means that we can't use our fabulous new deep learning systems. And my answer to them was, well, I don't care if you want to use your amazing new deep learning systems to play games, that's fine. But you're not seriously telling me that if you put them into an autopilot of a driverless car, that it's okay not to be able to find out, even in principle, why the AI failed and caused an accident, particularly if that accident was a fatality. So really what I'm saying is for safety-critical AI systems, safety-critical systems, we must always have transparency. Because if we don't, then we cannot find out why accidents happened, and we can't fix them. We can't make sure they don't happen again. Really, really important in my view. Okay, and my last slide in this particular segment in the first part of the talk. What does good ethical practice, good ethical governance look like in robotics and AI? One of the problems we have right now is that we have lots of good ethical principles. In fact, there's been an explosion of bodies, public bodies, private bodies, universities, charities, NGOs, publishing ethical principles. I wrote a blog post on this. No, it's not. Anyway, it's on my blog. I think the end of 2017. And there's a kind of explosion of ethical principles. But the problem is principles are not practice. And there's a big gap between principles and good practice. And as far as I can tell, nobody is actually doing good ethical practice in full. I mean, a lot of people are saying that, they're saying, well, of course, we have an ethics board, we have an ethics committee, and you say, well, who's on it? Oh, we're not telling you. Okay, well, what have you done that shows the effectiveness of your committee? Oh, it's private. Well, hang on, that's not ethical. I mean, if it's not transparent as far as I'm concerned, it's ethical, and that means that includes the process by which you conduct your research and development. So here's a kind of code of good ethical governance, which I think is a good starting point. So I would say to a company or a university or an organisation, you need 5 things. You need a code of conduct so that you all know what you're supposed to be doing. Ethical code of conduct. In fact, there are now professional ethical codes of conduct. The ACM published one last year. So did the IEEE, which is really good. Number 2, everybody should have training in ethics. Everybody. No exception. Not just the engineers, but everybody in the company, from the CEO, all the way down. And I've not written it here, but it's in the paper. You should also have a mechanism for whistleblowers. Really important. People in the company should be able to go to someone and know that they can disclose bad practice without fear of losing their job. That's really important. You should undertake ethical risk assessments of everything you do. That's going back to the point I made earlier about ethical risk assessment. Be transparent about your ethical governance. Be transparent about in your products, but also about the way that you develop them. I think that's really important. And finally, really value ethical governance. Don't just pay lip service, but when you say it, mean it. And the truth is that if CEOs are not sincere about, really valuing ethical governance, then nobody in the organisation is going to be sincere either. So leadership really has to come from the top. So my research colleague Marina Jorotka, who's in this department, she was ill tonight, so couldn't come along. But we wrote a paper on ethical governance that was published just a few months ago. So it's open source. You can go and read it in the Philosophical Transactions Royal Society. So if you search for Winfield and Jorotka ethical governance, you'll probably find it. Or you could email me if you can't. Okay, I'm just going to pause for a second. Lola's gone to sleep. That's probably a very good thing to do. And start to tell you about ethical robots. So this bit I hope will be more interesting. This has actual robots in it. So is it possible to build an ethical machine? So, could we build a machine capable of choosing its own actions on the basis of moral or ethical consideration. So until 5 years or so ago, I thought the answer was no, but I changed my mind. So what brought about the U-turn? Well, the first thing was thinking about simple ethical behaviours. So here's a thought experiment. So imagine that you're walking, imagine that you're standing and you see someone else walking along the pavement, peering at their smartphone. Of course, we never do that, do we? And there's a hole in the pavement. So this guy is about to fall in the hole in the ground. My guess is that you will try and intervene. If that happens in real life, well, many people would. Most people probably would. Okay, now, why is that, or how is that? Well, it's not just because you're a good person. It's because you also have the ability to predict the future. And that's an important observation. In other words, you can predict that this guy, if they don't pay attention, will fall in the hole, will come to harm. And you can also predict whether you might be able to intervene. So here's the same thing, but it's a thought. This is now a thought experiment. Instead of you, this is a robot. So this robot now has 4 next possible actions. So A is stand still, do nothing, in which case the human falls in the hole. B is turn left. Robot is fine, human dead. Okay. C is walk forwards. In that case, both the robot and the human fall into the hole, probably on top of each other, so that's not good either. But if the robot chooses action D, then it might just have a gentle collision with the human, so that the human is saved from falling into the hole. So these were thought experiments, and I realised that if you express that thought experiment as a logical rule, an ethical rule, it's this. So if for all robot actions the human is equally safe, then just do the thing that's safest for the robot. So output the action that keeps the robot safe. So in other words, if the human isn't walking toward the hole, then the robot either stands still or turns left. So the robot is safe. Otherwise, output the robot action for the least unsafe human outcome. Now, here's the fun thing. That's actually Asimov's first law of robotics. So, a robot may not injure a human or through inaction. That's very important. That or through inaction allow a human to come to harm. There are 2 other laws, but let's not worry about those. But people often say, yeah, but Asimov's laws of robotics, they were just a fictional device, because you can make interesting stories and play with the dilemmas, if you like, the conflicts between law 1 and law 2, and so on. That's all true, but nevertheless, you have to admit that Asimov was the first to establish the principle that robots should be governed by principles, and I think that's significant. And really, I make no apology for, if you like, basing some simple laboratory experimental work on this law. It's a perfectly sensible law. A robot tries not to injure a human and also tries to keep a human safe. That's not a bad principle, particularly if it's a care robot or whether it's a driverless car, for instance. Now, how do we make such a robot? Well, it turns out that technology for anticipating the future exists already. It's called a computer simulation. And of course, we have computer simulations. We use them in robotics all the time. This is a simulator for Weebots, showing a simulation of robots playing football. And you can even see in these little windows here the view from each of the robots. So we can even see the viewpoints, the view from the camera on each of the robots. I'm not sure whose camera is which one. Yes, I think that's probably the view from this robot here, who's looking down at the feet of this guy here, who's about to aim for goal. So, the idea then emerged. This was, if you like, the technical idea that we came up with, which is, why not put a simulation of a robot inside that very robot? In fact, a simulation of not only of itself, but of its environment, including other actors, other robots. So it means the robot has what we call a simulation-based internal model. It means that it can model and predict the future. Of course, it's technically tricky, and not surprisingly, because you have to make this work in real time. You have to make it work very quickly and continuously in real time, so that the robot is continuously looking ahead into the future. What might happen, from now? What might happen from now? Every so often. And we call this architecture a consequence engine, because it's an engine, a piece of computational machinery for allowing a robot to figure out the consequences of its actions. And the way it works is that you have a simulator. This is the simulator, this bit here, which you initialize with the state of the world, using all of this machinery here, and then you loop through all of the robot's next possible actions. And for each one of them, you simulate ahead in time, typically around 10 seconds. It's not very far in time. And for each of those next possible actions, you evaluate the likely consequences. You don't know for sure that those consequences would happen, but nevertheless, it's an estimate of what might happen if the robot stood still or turned left or went straight ahead or whatever. And then you choose your next action on the basis of some logic that decides, and this could be a safe robot, it could be an ethical robot. In fact, we've used the same architecture for several different kinds of experiments, and I'm only really talking about one this evening, which is the ethical robot experiments. So that's the consequence engine. Now, does it work? Well, it does actually, and we've done 2 sets of experiments. So the first set of experiments was done by my student Christian Blum, and essentially the setup you can see here, it looks like a football pitch. In fact, it's not. We're not using it as a football pitch. It's just a piece of flooring that was convenient. So we have a hole in the ground. This is the hole in the ground. It's basically the same experiment that I mentioned earlier, the thought experiment. So we have a hole in the ground. It's not a real hole. It's a virtual hole. And we have the ethical robot, which is like you, if you like, the good robot. And you have the H robot, which is the hapless human not looking where they're going. Okay, so the H robot is heading in the direction of the hole. Now the A robot also is heading somewhere. It's heading over here. It's called the goal. It's the goal position for the A robot. It's not really the goal, this goal. It's this goal here. So the A robot has to also not fall into the hole. That's very important. And the A robot has to stop the H robot from falling into the hole. We then repeated the same experiment with these now robots, these little humanoid robots, and that was done by Dieter van der Elst. So let me show you some movies of those experiments. So this is the first one of those, and you'll see that it takes us a couple of seconds to load up. Here we go. So the A robot heads off and notices the H robot, gentle collision, H robot is now safe, and the A robot goes towards its destination, which is over here. So it works. Beautiful, really beautiful. And this is 4 times speeded up. It works. Fantastic. 16 times. In fact, it works every single time. So every single repeat of the experiment, and because these are real robots, every experiment is a little bit different because of noise and real world. The motors are all a bit different, and the sensors and so on. So it works. Fantastic. Okay. And as I mentioned, we also, a couple of years later, so I'm kind of compressing time a bit here, tried it with these robots. This is the ethical robot, this is the human, and you can see that, and this is danger, this is the ethical robot's destination. And you can see that the ethical robot, again, saves the human, the red one, from going toward danger. So, going back to the previous experiment, when we wrote the paper, I said to Christian, I said, this is really boring because we've done the experiment and it works. That's boring, isn't it? So I said to Christian, why don't you put two humans heading towards the hole at the same time? In other words, an ethical dilemma. And that's what he did. And we believe that this experiment is the world's first trial of a real robot facing a balanced ethical dilemma. And you'll see what happens. So here again is A, two humans both heading toward the hole. So A, and, oh, hang on, no. So both 8 robots plunge to their doom in the hole. They both fall in the center. So what is going on here? We know that the A robot can save one of them every time. In fact, it does save one of them. Now, you notice it turned round and turned back to look at the other. It was too late. Too late. And in fact, yes, it saves one of the two about half of the time. About half of the time. Which is very puzzling because when we, when you know that the robot can save one of them every single time, then why doesn't it just do that? In fact, so I'm not telling you the whole truth. In around 35 runs of this experiment, actually the A robot saved both of them, I think, twice. Both of them. It saved one of them about 15 times, and it saved neither of them maybe 16 or 17 times, a little bit more. So most of the time, but not by very much, it saved neither of them. And, for a couple of days we thought, well, hang on, this is interesting, but why? Why? I mean, we know that the A robot can save one of them really reliably, so how come it's doing so badly? But of course, it's obvious once we realise what's happening. So the consequence engine is running 2 times a second. So twice a second, the robot is anticipating the future. Basically, what that means is that every half a second, the A robot has the opportunity to change its mind. It doesn't have a mind, of course, but the point is that it can change its decision. So yes, we've built the world's first ethical robot. Well, it's actually probably not, but one of the world's first ethical robots. Certainly the world's first robot to face an ethical dilemma. But we've also built a pathologically indecisive robot. So imagine yourself in the situation where there are 2 children, both heading towards a hole in the ground, and instead of rushing across and saving one of them and then trying to save the other, what you do is you go, no, I'll save that one. No, I'll save this one. No, I'll save that one. And you dither. Now, and that's exactly what's happening. And in some of the movies, you see that dithering really well. So by allowing the robot to change its, or if you like, recalculate its decision every half a second, you're also making it dither. You're making it indecisive. Now, that's clearly not a good strategy. So that's the explanation. But it's kind of fun, isn't it? It's interesting. It makes you think about how robots might solve real-world dilemmas. Of course, I don't think they should be. I think it's quite wrong to expect robots to solve real-world ethical dilemmas. But that's, if you like, I'll come on to the ethics, if you like, of ethical machines. So, how ethical is our ethical robot? Well, it implements a form of consequentialist ethics. So, and the important thing is this: the robot behaves ethically not because it chooses to, but because it's programmed to. So it's really an ethical zombie. In other words, the difference between you and I and this robot is that we can choose to be good, or we can choose not to be good. And even if we choose to be good, we can choose our ethics, because we use different ethics in different circumstances. So if you're deciding, for instance, whether to save someone about to hurt themselves, that's a different set of considerations to when you're deciding whether to invest, where to invest in an ethical bank. That's a different kind of ethics, So there are all kinds of schools of ethics, virtue ethics, deontic ethics, consequentialist, utilitarian ethics. So we are capable, as adult humans of sound mind. We're not all adult humans yet, but essentially we are capable of not only behaving ethically, but choosing our ethics to suit the circumstances. And what's even more important, we understand what ethics are, and we can justify our actions afterwards. And of course, if we make a mistake, which humans often do, then we may well be held to account. We may well be called to answer for that mistake. Why did you do that? That was a bad thing to do. Now, our robot can't do any of those things. So yes, it reasons about ethics, but it doesn't know what ethics are, and is not capable of explaining why it made a particular decision. Okay. However, there is a really nice side effect, if you like, of this particular architecture. And this is another paper that I did with Marina Girotka here in Oxford, called The Case for an Ethical Black Box. So we think that one of the advantages of having this simulation-based internal model is that it becomes very easy for us to store every internal decision of the robot, not just what's happening externally, but also the internal decisions. And this is, of course, an aircraft flight data recorder. They're not, of course, black. They're orange, even though they're called black boxes. And we think that not just these robots, not just ethical robots, but all robots should be fitted with a flight data recorder, with a data logger, all of them. So whether they're driverless cars, they're drones, they're medical diagnosis AIs, they're AIs that decide loan applications, they're care robots, we think all of them should have the equivalent of a data logger that can store with timestamps every decision that when I say every decision, I don't mean forever. What I mean is recently. So aircraft flight data recorders don't store everything forever. They store only typically the last 24 hours of flight data, and then it loops back. So we think this is really important, because otherwise you can't investigate accidents. And in fact, in a new project that we have together, in fact, Helena's also involved in the project, we're going to be actually setting up mock, kind of staged robot accidents in order to start to, if you like, understand and construct frameworks for how to do robot accident investigations. So we think this is really important. Nobody's done it before. Yet robots are having accidents already, even fatal accidents, and there will be more. So we think it's really important to really understand how to do robot accident investigations so that we can then figure out what went wrong. Again, it's the transparency thing that I was talking about earlier, and make sure it doesn't happen again. But going back to our ethical robots, well, what's the big thing that we learned? Well, for me, the biggest lesson, and a surprise, is that you do not need to build a sentient robot, a conscious robot, in order to build an ethical robot. So in other words, we don't need to build data from Star Trek in order to have a robot behave ethically. We don't need a major breakthrough in AI to build an ethical robot. In other words, I think an ethical zombie is just fine. In fact, I'd rather it was only an ethical zombie and not something smarter than that. So I think that's an interesting, if you like, insight from that work. And, we have a paper with Dieter and I had a paper at the beginning of last year called The Dark Side of Ethical Robots. And this is where we started to think, this is, me being a worrier again. okay, so we can make an ethical robot. Should we make ethical robots? So in other words, we're starting to ask about the morality of moral machines. Because, just because you can make a thing doesn't mean you should make a thing. Now, one of the problems with ethical robots, and Dieter in this paper did a brilliant piece of work. He basically built a robot with this consequence engine, and the robot was playing a shell game. You know these games where you have to guess, where the coin is, whether it's which cup it's underneath, and then the person, normally a swindler, is moving them around, and you think you know where it is, and you're always wrong. Okay, so it's a shell game, and he built a shell game where the robot is helping a human to win the shell game, to play the shell game. It's like a robot helper. But he changed the code in the robot, the code from being an ethical robot. So he discovered that if you change a tiny piece of code, in fact it was less than one line of code, it turned the ethical robot, the robot that would help the human, to a robot that would compete with the human, competitive robot, or a robot that would just basically do all it can, so that the human doesn't win. In other words, an aggressive robot. So we discovered that a tiny change of the code turns an ethical robot into either a competitive or an aggressive robot. Now, you may think, well, so what? Well, think about robots being hacked. Think about cyber security. Cars, not just driverless cars, but regular cars have already been hacked. Some guys, white hat hackers, hijacked a car several years ago, and the driver didn't know what was happening because the windows started going up and down, the radio started changing channels and so on, and it's because they hacked into the car, through the wireless network. It's very easy to hack systems, I have to say, and so I think that a big problem, therefore, with ethical robots is the danger they might be hacked. I think that there are other problems, but that's just one of them. So right now, even though I think we could build ethical robots in principle, at least simple ethical robots, I'm not sure we should. And at that point, I think I'll conclude the talk. And I did just want to thank my colleagues, Wengu, Christian, Dieter, and of course Marina, who's not here. And here are some concluding remarks. We need standards, regulation, ethical governance. We need responsible research and innovation. We need robots that are designed ethically. And we need to also worry about the ethics of ethical robots. And above all, transparency. Thank you very much indeed for listening. And I think, Sheila, that we have half an hour for questions and answers. Yeah, great. So I'm going to do a thing which I often do, which is I'd like to ask questions alternately from a lady and a gentleman. So, and I'll start with you, if I may.
You said originally, just as a statement, that a gendered robot is unethical, but you didn't say why.
Yes, it's a good question. I have a blog post on that. I suppose the fundamental reason is because robots cannot have gender in any meaningful sense. So the question is, why would you gender a robot? Why would you give it, overtly female or, for that matter, overtly male characteristics?
But why would it be unethical?
Well, I think the let me put it this way. If sexism wasn't a thing, if misogyny didn't exist, then I wouldn't mind at all. I wouldn't have any concerns whatsoever. But I think the problem is that when you're, let's take robots that are gendered, female, and particularly sex robots, they're almost overwhelmingly female robots. What you're doing is that by creating a gendered object, I think you're deepening the objectification. of women, of real women, as well as, you know, it sounds odd, doesn't it? How can you objectify an object? But of course you're objectifying the thing that the object represents. So I'm probably not giving you the full story, but essentially I think you're furthering, if you like, one of the great evils of humankind, which is sexism, by gendering robots.
Do you not feel that there is an argument that people do interact differently, males and females interact differently? Females may have different characteristics that make them more suitable for particular situations.
Yeah, but when you start to scratch the surface, what do you mean by that? What you probably mean is robots that look like women are more appropriate for servile roles. Well, I think I would reject that completely, because again you're perpetuating a gender stereotype.
People choose their silly gender.
Say again?
People choose their silly gender, and you would say that was wrong, shouldn't be allowed to.
I didn't know that Siri came. I mean, some of the chatbots you cannot choose the gender.
Yeah.
So for instance, Alexa, and I think the speakers, the smart speakers, typically only come in one gender, and it's female. So
Apple speech synthesis allows any gender.
It's people often say to me, yes, but voice, things that have voices have to be gendered. That's not true. There are plenty of non-gendered voices. So,
we're used to dealing with non-androgynous voices.
Well,
you're dealing with people.
Yes, but we're used to dealing with those, with gender. Generally speaking, talking of humanity in general. I mean, all of you accepted in this room. I'm sure that you're all, extraordinarily, sensitive to each other, but most people are not, and I think that it's.
I'm not denying there's a problem.
Yeah, and the problem, I mean, in a sense, I wouldn't mind so much if the manufacturers of these systems were even aware of the problem, and so it comes back to the question of ethical risk assessment. Is your robot gendered? Have you thought about it? Why? Why is your robot? Does your robot really need to be gendered? So sorry, we've had it. I'm going to go back to another woman. So yes, please.
So on the topic of worrying.
Say again.
On the topic of worrying.
Worrying, yes.
So you worry that maybe it's unethical to make an ethical robot.
Yeah.
But in having that worry, do you not further worry that you're just sort of succumbing to hackers, really, and that's just that we shouldn't?
Yeah,
anyway?
it's a very good point. The problem is this, that and this at all of the recent AI conferences and workshops I've been to, at the end of the workshop, we've all agreed the big problem in AI is not AI, it's cybersecurity. And in a sense, it comes back to this point. If we had strong cybersecurity, then I wouldn't worry. I wouldn't have the worry that I explained then. And the fact is we don't. I mean, the so-called Internet of Technology devices are extremely weak. I mean, I don't have any in my house because I don't trust the security. And I wouldn't advise you to have any in your house either. I mean, we don't even have the standards yet for secure Internet of Technology devices. The standards are only just being written. They're far from being implemented, and they're not strong enough. So, in a sense, I wouldn't worry if we had strong cybersecurity, but we don't.
Does that not mean we're sort of in the wrong field?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, yes. I'm too old though, but I mean, my PhD was in information theory, and I did some cryptography when I was in industry 30 years ago. So I kind of understand that stuff, but no, I mean, I'm too old to start researching. Robotics in general, yes. Well, I mean, yes, you might well construct an argument, which is why on earth are we even bothering with robots? But I mean, having said all of having worried you, if you like, for the last hour, well, I hope I've intrigued you as well, particularly with the ethical robots. I think that robots still have huge benefit. I mean, in our lab we have, in Bristol, we have amazing medical and surgical robotics. We have robots that help, when they're developed, will help surgeons to do laparoscopy, will help surgeons to feel, literally with their fingers, what the tissue that the end of the laparoscopic instrument is touching. We call it remote telehaptics. We have an assisted living studio full of robots that can help elderly people with independent living. We are working on driverless cars. We have quite a lot of that work. So yes, I mean, I think that robots. I mean, we have amazing work in wearable robotics. I think that's a fantastically ethical kind of robotics. So, I think that there's a realistic possibility that within 10, 15, 20 years, wheelchairs should be completely obsolete. Completely. So I think robotics should be able to realistically solve mobility problems for, the disabled, elderly, injured people, even people with serious spinal cord injuries. So, there are lots of reasons to be positive about robotics and AI. Yes. So...
Brilliant talk. You said that robots should always be able to explain the decisions that they've made, but humans can't always explain the decisions they've made. If you've ever got into a car accident, people that didn't see you there running. Why do you want to hold robots to a higher standard than humans?
Because robots are not responsible.
Why not? I mean,
they can't be responsible. You can't hold a machine responsible for something. How would you sanction the machine?
Well, you would say, like, a 10-year-old doesn't have criminal responsibility, but after a certain, you blame the parent perhaps, and after a certain point you say, well, you are now mature enough to be responsible for your actions.
Okay, well, I mean, in the far future, we might, but I'm talking, science fiction. When we can build data from Star Trek, then maybe we will admit, that the robot may well be, as it were, held responsible for its own actions. But until then, and I think it's very far into the future, robots cannot be responsible for their actions, or AIs, and therefore we must hold them to a higher standard of account. Because, if a robot isn't responsible for its actions, who is? Well, it's its designer, manufacturer, owner, operator, and you can't discover and hold whoever was responsible to account unless you can figure out exactly what went wrong. So those are the reasons. It's about responsibility, really. Thank you. So this lady here.
Thank you, Professor Winfield. Thank you for your fascinating talk. I'm a robot maker. I make soccer robots.
Oh, fantastic.
So I'm really interested in, because I also saw some soccer robot like now. I made middle-sized league for RoboCup.
Yes, I'm familiar with RoboCup.
Oh, perfect. So would you mind telling me more concerns of, like, for example, soccer robot? Because the goal of soccer robot is actually trying to build a team to against a human champion team, like in 2050. Well, that's our goal when we set our team, and we do have that kind of passion. But we do want to present. We want the robots can be a safe robot, and we don't want to harm people. But in what way?
Yes, thank you. It's a great question. So in case any of you didn't quite hear the point, what you were saying was that the goal, if you like, I'm sorry for the term, of soccer robotics is that by the year 2050 there should be a team of robots that can play football against a team of humans and beat a team of humans. So that's the kind of vision, if you like, of soccer robotics. And it's an amazing vision. It really is an amazing vision. But, of course, the problem is those robots are going to be have to be not only very smart, but also very nimble, very physically capable. I mean, if you watch soccer robotics right now, particularly the humanoid robots, the ones that have legs, you'll see it's very slow. So the robots are kind of doing this. and what they'll do is and then they'll stop, and then go like that. And then the ball will just roll along. So it's really slow. And of course a human, if you built soccer robots the same size as humans, a human footballer right now would run rings literally around the robot. But you can't, even if we could make the robots smart enough, the problem is they're not safe because they'd be too heavy. Most of the robots that are the same size as humans and have the same strength, like the Atlas robot in the US, I think it weighs, 200 kilograms or something like that, and consumes 3.5 kilowatts of power. So, a fundamental problem in robotics is that we can't make robots yet that are as light and as strong as humans and consume no more energy. So those, if you like, some of the big problems in robotics, physical robots, are about what we call soft robotics and about energy. So we have in my lab, again, a group, a soft robotic group, and they're working on what we call artificial muscles. The point is that robots right now, all the robots I've shown you, have electric motors. Electric motors are too heavy and they consume too much power, far more power than muscles. And even AI consumes too much power. So, the DeepMind AlphaGo that beat Lee Sedol at Go, it's a great achievement for an AI until you remember that in a game of Go, lasts 2 hours, the energy cost of the AI was several hundreds of kilowatts. The energy cost of the human was about the same as the calorific value of a bowl of soup. So basically, until you show me an AI that can beat, a Go player running on a bowl of soup, then I'm not impressed. So in essence, I don't know if you'd agree with me, but I think that we already have some very smart soccer playing algorithms, in other words, the AI. So we can do teamwork, we can do anticipation and stuff like that. The problem is we can't build bodies that are fast, nimble and light. They have to be light because when you collide with them, they don't break you. One of the aims of robotics, long-term aims, is to build robots that are about the same weight and strength and energy consumption as humans, typically small humans, because we don't want robots that big. We'd rather have robots that big, So that's that's far from a solved problem. It's a very hard problem. So great question. Thank you. Please, sir.
You suggested that human-level robots, machines, AI, will be impossible for 100 years. I'd like to suggest to you that this might be totally wrong, for the following reason, that, for example, there are two international groups doing brain modelling on a 10-year plan, and there have been huge advances in neuroscience and the study of the brain, and in scanning and in storing the data, etc., etc. Quite a lot of the experts in the field believe that this will just carry on, and that there will come a time when we'll be able to do real-time neuronal modelling and so on. Right. Besides which, it is possible that there might be genuine scientific advances in neuroscience and cognitive science, so that we might actually understand how the human mind actually works. Yes. And it might actually be simple at the basic level. I accept that entirely. And this could happen in 20 years.
Well, it could happen tomorrow. There might be some super smart kid, a genius kid in Mumbai at this very moment, who's, perhaps without realising it, discovered the architecture of the human mind. But, realistically, it's unlikely. It's not impossible, you're right, unlikely. But let me go back to your first thing. So what you were talking about is called whole brain emulation. So in essence, there are three approaches to designing human equivalent AI. So they are design it from first principles, which is essentially, if you like, build a computational model of the human mind, which we don't know how to do that because we don't have the architecture. So we don't understand how the human mind works well enough to be able to build a computational model of it. And as you say, someone might figure that out tomorrow, or it might take 200 years of painstaking incremental work. Okay. The second approach is evolve it. So use artificial evolution. And I wrote a paper several years ago at the conference A-Life called The Energy Cost of Evolution. And the problem is that evolution is extraordinarily energetically profligate. The energy cost of evolving anything is vast. And so, and I worked out, I did some kind of simple, calculations and worked out that the energy cost of evolving anything of equivalent neuronal complexity, synaptic complexity, would take the whole of the energetic output, the whole of the energy created, on the planet for about 20 years. Nothing else. And the third one is whole brain emulation. And generally speaking, the AI community regard that as the least favourite of the three options.
So that's because it's run by neuroscientists?
No, it's not. No, it's not. I mean, the problem is, and I have a bit of insight because I was on the ethics board for 5 years or so for the Human Brain Project, which is the European effort. And yes, there are brilliant people working in it. It's an extraordinarily good project. But the problem is that, there are all sorts of problems. The problem with brain emulation is that you need the wiring map. And in fact, the technical term that's used for it is the connectome. So the connectome is the word that's used for the wiring diagram for a brain, for a whole brain. Now, when you consider that you have in your brain, 10 to the 10 or so neurons, but each one of those has something, maybe 10,000, maybe 100,000 connections. We're not even sure how many connections there are in the human brain. So the number of connections is vast, is absolutely enormous. Now, how many animals do we have the complete connectome for so far? Do we have the connectome for the mouse? No. Do we have the connectome for an ant? No. In fact, the most complicated animal that we have the complete connectome for is the nematode worm, C. elegans. C. elegans has 302 neurons and about 1,000 and something connections. That's the only animal that we have the complete connectome for. And does that mean we can make an artificial C. elegans? No. We still don't understand well enough the internal workings, the biochemistry, the electrochemistry of those neurons, those 302 neurons, well enough to construct. I mean, we can build a simulation of bits of the behaviour of C. elegans. Yes, we can do that. And I'd recommend you look at the Open Worm project because it's all open science. It's fabulous. So it's a great project, but that is as far as we've got. So if you in order to have the complete connectome of the human brain in 10 or 20 years, surely by now we'd have had to have the complete connectome of at least,
No.
Really?
No.
Why?
That's not how science works.
Yeah, but
for example, the new work on proteins is very exciting.
Okay, well, with respect, I don't have that. Share your confidence. I mean, and here's the thing: even if you did have the complete connectome, you still probably wouldn't have a thinking human. Because and there's a whole nother, and I could give another lecture on this. On the problem is that human minds only exist inside human bodies. Okay.
But that's an assumption.
No, it's true. It's true. There isn't a single human mind on the planet that exists out with a human body.
There might be alien minds on other planets.
Okay, but the point is that I suppose what I'm getting at is that human intelligence, in fact, the only intelligence we know, animal intelligence, is all embodied. And I don't think you can make an artificial human without a body. So, you know, a brain in a box, I mean, even if you could make a brain in the box, you turn it on, I suspect if the thing, you know, if the intelligence, if the brain, if you like, emerged into phenomenal consciousness, I suspect it would go mad instantly.
And the other thing is...
So it's probably deeply unethical, apart from anything else, to switch it on even. So I'm sorry to be so disparaging, but yeah.
Yeah, what we're talking about at the moment, like about artificial intelligence, or we're mainly touching on the intellect side of things at the moment.
Well, we're talking about the mind, essentially.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
we're not entirely sure what minds are, of course. We have no idea how consciousness works, you know.
So, and also when you talk about intelligence is not just in your brain.
Exactly, you're right.
In your entire body.
Yes, quite right.
So
yes,
the bit that we
and in fact, you know, the so-called central nervous system extends to the ends of your fingertips and the ends of, and you need all of it to work, you know.
So that's why it's so far.
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, I've written several blog posts, and you're welcome to engage. You know, I'd be happy to continue the argument with you. But, so I'll take maybe one more question, if I may, from the lady over there. Is that okay, Sheila?
You talked earlier about different ethical schools of thought.
Yes.
If I could frame this, I'm wondering if you think there's a particular ethical framework that is particularly suited to making decisions about the ethics of things like robotics. So to frame that with an example, if you take your dithering robots, I could flip a coin and decide which child I'm going to save, but Kant probably wouldn't think of that as being particularly the ethical action, but it would have the result of saving a child. So do you think that a consequentialist school of thought of ethics is more useful in terms of coming up with something that we might recognise as being ethical?
Speaking as an engineer, yes. This is the only one I know how to build. but I mean, it's a great question, and one of the reasons that I and others like me are working with ethicists and proper, you know, moral philosophers is that we really need to understand and in fact build what we call a new computational ethics. So a very good friend of mine who is an ethicist believes that in principle it is possible to build a kind of calculus, if you like, which would allow you to express multiple ethical frameworks in such a way that you could then build a machine that would choose according to the context which ethical framework to apply in a given situation. I think that's really exciting. In fact, we're trying, so far we've failed successive grant applications to actually get a grant to work on computational ethics. But I think that's probably what we need. Yes. It's a great question. Well, in fact, they're all great questions.
Can I echo what somebody over there said? Absolutely brilliant.
Thank you very much indeed. That's very kind. Thank you. Thank you.